Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be here with you today. I am sure that this has been an amazing day of learning for all of you, and I appreciate the time that you have taken to engage with one another and the amazing presenters today. And I hope that I'm just going to continue to um, encourage your thinking about the work that you all are doing in your districts, your schools, your classrooms, really wherever you are. So I just want to share with you a couple things before we begin. Sometimes I might just talk myself through some of the technology that we're having here today because it's a little new, but I think that's what we do as students. We take risks and learn things together. The title of the session that I'm going to share with you today is called Interrogating Texts Across the Day and Across the Grades. And some of you might already be tweeting, but if you have any comments or questions, any affirmations, wonderings that you would like to share, you can use this hashtag, the EdCollab Gathering hashtag 13 for today. And you are always welcome to tweet me, tweet to me or tweet anything connected to this session if you would like to as well. So I just want to start by talking a little bit about the overview for today's session. I first want to talk a little bit about the conditions that are required for interrogating texts in the classroom. And I want to talk about, in a single classroom, some ideas that teachers can keep in mind. I also want to talk about what teachers can think about across the day, not just in a single, for example, English class, but also in content area classes. And I also want to help you think a little bit vertically as well. So when students leave your class, what are they also being held accountable to in terms of interrogating texts as well? Something that I like to share with people that I believe is really important for the work that we're doing is that I want to make clear that a lot of what I'm going to be sharing today isn't necessarily new ideas, but it's probably ideas that you already have learned, you already know, and it's important for us to just revisit some of those ideas. I'm very much about some fundamental aspects of teaching literacy to students, and I want to make sure that you're thinking about those as you continue forward. The other thing that I believe is really important in the most recent work that I've done, I'm a literacy coach at a public school in Manhattan in New York, is that a lot of the professional development that I believe that I have learned over the past several years has been so wonderful. And so much of it is targeted specifically toward the individual teacher, what you can do in your classroom, how you can design units, what materials might be effective for your students, or charts and so forth. And all of those things are so important. Something that I've been thinking about a lot more recently is how do we make our practices have traction for our students' experiences? So not just about what you can do in your individual classroom, but even thinking about how do you collaborate with your colleagues down the hall, in another grade, in your school, to be able to support students to transfer the skills that you value so much in literacy on and on across the day and across the grades. I think about research that has mentioned, for example, by Charles Payne, that suggests that all of our efforts are really important in the individual classroom, but sometimes, unfortunately, they can be temporary if we don't think about school-wide implications for those practices as well. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this work. And I think the other thing that I might say about that is that, unfortunately, I believe that teachers' practice is often considered to be such an individualized experience. And our school days, our professional experiences aren't necessarily designed always for collaboration, but I'm just trying to encourage that idea. So as I mentioned, I'm the literacy coach of a public middle school and high school. It's grades 6 to 12. And so a lot of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about today stem from the practices that we have we are growing and we are implementing at the school. By no means am I suggesting that these practices are perfect for every student and every teacher all the time, but we are a school community that's committed to always growing for our students. And so some of these practices I think could be valuable to be thinking about. And I want to share with you the demographics of our school as well. So most of our students are Latina, Latino, and we also have a population of Asian, Black, and white students. 1% of our population are English language learners, and 27% of our students receive special education services. I've often shared the statistics of our school, those demographics, because in an urban setting, sometimes these statistics or these demographics connote school failure. And as I mentioned, I am fortunate to work in a community where people really care about students' academic, social, and emotional growth, and really try to work and coordinate their efforts so that they're meeting students' development and encouraging and facilitating that. And so I want us to continue to be thinking about not just the narrative of urban school failure, but also the narrative of success as well in urban schools. So I want to share with you a little bit about what needs to be in place for interrogating texts. Before we start to even think about interrogating text, here are some things I believe need to actually be happening in an English classroom, most likely, for us to even be thinking about interrogating text across the day and across the grades. And like I said before, some of these features are ones that you've seen and you know and you've practiced time and time again in your own classrooms, but I'm just reminding us of what we hold dear. So modeling, time, choice for writing, choice for reading, feedback on student work, whether it's oral, whether it's formative, whether it's public or private, all of those things really matter. I want us to dig in today into these other three on the right: substantive texts, talk, and writing. So what do I mean by substantive texts? So I'm going to share with you some examples of the kinds of texts that I'm talking about when I mean substantive texts. When I mean substantive texts, I'm talking about really good stories that feature provocative characters, problems, and experiences. I'm talking about texts that are relevant culturally and socially and politically to students' experiences. Like Christine Sleater says, I'm talking about texts through which students can see their lives reflected, as in the mirrors, and also they can see their lives that are unfamiliar to them as well. And so when I talk about substantive, one of the most major conditions of students' ability to interrogate texts well is that there have to be good texts worth reading and asking questions about. So here are some examples in our middle school of some of the stories that students are reading, some of my favorites. The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. I'm enjoying right now actually his memoir. Students in the 7th grade read that as a shared text. To Kill a Mockingbird, a classic in the 8th grade. The Skin I'm In by Sharon Flake. Students in the 6th grade read it. Totally Joe, about a student who's asserting his sexuality in middle school. And also some classics like Romeo and Juliet and 12 Angry Men. And there are also some high school texts as well. Something that we often try in the high school when we're featuring substantive texts is against titles that students might not necessarily choose during independent reading, but that we believe is really going to help them grapple with how they're making sense of their realities, of their communities that they live in, and their own personal lives. So we see things like Jhumpa Lahiri is actually featured twice here in the 9th grade and 10th grade. Fahrenheit 451, Kindred by Octavia Butler. I'm so happy to say that at my school, as much as Shakespeare is part of the canon at my school, about 2 or 3 grades read Shakespeare. About 3 grades at my school read as a shared text some piece of Octavia Butler, whether it's short stories or also whole class texts. And so that feels really wonderful as well. Plays as well, so August Wilson and Fences. And one of the things that I believe also matters is that there's a wide range of texts. So I just showed you some whole class texts, some novels, some chapter books. But at our school, some of the substantive texts that I'm also talking about are digital texts, movies, episodes of TV shows, videos, trailers, music, podcasts, and a range of short texts like short stories, articles and other informational texts, even long form journalism as well. And again, all of these things are helping our students to make sense of the world that they live in and make sense of their lives as well. And I believe that that's an important precondition for the students' ability to interrogate texts and our ability to support them to do so. So I want to talk to you about another condition that needs to be met in order for students to be doing meaningful work. I want to talk a little bit about writing about interrogating texts. One of the things that I believe earlier in my career that I really wanted to emphasize was students' ability to write in literary analysis in a really robust way. And I know that I would get frustrated after reading a shared text, for example, that students might not be able to write as powerfully as they did sometimes when they discussed or while we were reading. And something that I've turned or returned to in my more recent experience is that informal writing needs to be a regular activity in the classroom. Informal writing needs to happen pretty regularly, where students are able to respond to the text, and not just respond, but also be able to articulate what is it they're thinking, how are they tracking their ideas about a particular story. In that way, it's like they're making their ideas visible, and so they can go back when they are then preparing to write a longer, more formal piece, so they can synthesize those ideas and put them together. So if we want to be able to push our students to interrogate text and writing, in their writing, I've just put up here some prompts that I know have worked well for some of our students in middle school and high school. And you can imagine that you might want to adapt some of these prompts depending on where your students are. But let's take a look, for example, the first one, this is mostly about, and some examples of that are, so that's like a fancy way of supporting students to get to the main idea of their writing, of the reading that they're doing. The second one ends up being important too. What is the writer trying to convince me of, and how do I know? The thing that I really value or appreciate about this particular prompt is that now we're encouraging students to not only interact with the text, but we're also encouraging students to interact with the actual writer. And so when I'm asking students to interrogate text throughout the day, it's not just about what the words are saying, but it's also about interrogating who actually wrote the piece and thinking about their positionality, what their bias is, and what their stance is. And I believe that if we really want students to be able to analyze text well, they have to think about the person behind the words on the page. And so I think that prompt ends up leading us toward that. A third one that I believe ends up being really important is a recurring image or idea is. It's a spin on pushing students to be able to find main idea. If they're not able to find the main idea or a controlling idea in a story or in a text, I believe that this prompt, a recurring image or idea, can also help students get there too. The reason why is because it pushes students to go back to the text and think line by line, which details keep on coming up for this author? What do they continue to go back to over and over again? And I believe that if we share this prompt with our students, then they're able to look across all those recurring ideas to be able to develop the main idea. There are some students who can find the main idea once they've read a few paragraphs. And there are some students who need to be able to track those details. And so that prompt allows students to get there. And then the last one was, how does this article or short story continue, shift direction, or expand the focus of previous things I've learned or read? So the thing that I find really important about this particular prompt is that it encourages students to think now about integrating what they already know about a particular topic or what they've come to believe about a particular issue, and integrate that with the new knowledge that they are developing from reading that text. And so then not only are they interacting with the author, but they're positioning themselves with the new learning of the text too, and they're able to think about, well, how do I situate my own thinking into this particular article or story or these ideas? And so I think that the reason why that prompt ends up being so important is because I want students to always be in conversation with the words and the author. And so it's almost as if they're activating their own knowledge to be able to deepen their own learning about the text. And I believe that's going to lead to greater interrogation. So I'm going to, I'm going to go back to the slides, just talking my way through it. Thanks for your patience. So I wanted to show an example of some modeling that I did actually for our staff about how I might use that last prompt in particular. At the beginning of the school year, we read some articles together as a staff about race and racism in schools. And so here's some writing that I did. And I actually want to focus on this second paragraph that I did. The first one was kind of like a rough draft. So I wrote, I've already learned that implicit bias may be more pervasive and odious than explicit bias. So here I'm asserting what I already know as a reader. But in The Root of Discipline Disparities, Ford wants me to understand that implicit bias is often at the root of disparities that exist in education. So you see here, I'm building a little bit, I'm connecting what I used to know, what new learning I'm gaining. For example, he explains that implicit bias shapes our thinking about students of color that makes smart initiatives essentially futile. So the thing that's happening here in my own experience of using these prompts is that I'm trying to build ideas piece by connecting what I know to what the author is sharing with me, and then to what new information, what examples and evidence he's providing from the text as well. And I believe that's an important condition for interrogating texts. So I'm going to go back to the slides here and talk to you about another condition for interrogating texts, which I believe is talk. I remember reading something years ago when I was doing some research on literacy in classrooms that suggested that on average, students in most classes, English, science, you name it, have about 2 minutes per class to have substantive conversation on the topic that they're studying. 2 minutes. And I remember, I'm thinking about my own education, that where my teachers largely lectured to us or really at us and we took notes, a fairly passive experience that I rarely got a chance to talk and really solidify what I was thinking. And so I believe that it could be true that often students have such a little amount of time in class to actually do their own talking about what they're learning. So I want to just show you something that we've been doing at our school to try to combat that. When students are reading the shared text, I showed you the different examples of the shared text at our school. They're writing pretty regularly about those texts, but they also have the time to discuss those texts as well. We call them accountable talks. I don't think that's really an original name. Those accountable talks, what usually happens is we split the class in half. So one teacher will facilitate a discussion with about 13 students. And when I say facilitate, it's really, the teacher takes on a really passive role of just really taking notes during the discussion. And it's students' responsibility to raise ideas, to lead the discussion, to build off each other's ideas, and to carry the discussion for at least around a half an hour. And so sometimes as the literacy coach, teachers ask me to facilitate another group of students during the same time. And so I wanted to share with you one example of a 10th grade student, a class, about 13 or so students who were facilitating a discussion on The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri. So my role was just to get them started, and I transcribed a little bit of what they were saying. I'm going to show you that for a second. Oh, sorry. I keep on showing you the wrong thing. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Let me see if it's this one then. Oh, no, I don't. Oh, wait, let me see. I'm going to pull it up. We can do this. Okay, I hope you can see this okay. So this is just an example of a discussion that about 12 students had based on their reading of The Namesake of Jhumpa Lahiri. And so the teachers posed this question, a pretty broad question: which played a larger role in The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri? Was it alienation or was it marginalization? And so Justin started, and I just wanted to read aloud some of the bold parts just for the sake of time. Justin started, and he said, even when Ashok was around, she felt alienated, talking about Ashima, one of the main characters. Eric says, I agree. He didn't know if he was, Gogol, one of the other main characters, he didn't know if he was American or not. And Cormac adds on and says, he can finally recognize the significance of the gift his father gives him, the overcoat, the inspiration of his name. Students continue. Justin adds, in the beginning of the book, Gogol didn't seem connected to his roots. At the end, it said, and he continues, he starts to pick up the book and read. He wants to feel secure, have his father's protection, and know where he got his name. He became appreciative of his Bengali roots in his name. And Fatu says, I'm adding on to the idea of it taking time to assimilate to a different culture. And Julia adds, toward the end, he realizes that it is important to see where you come from. Karina says, Gogol is looking for acceptance. His relationship with Mashumi emphasizes that. And Justin adds, you can't have a strong relationship with anyone if you don't know yourself. So I just want to name out loud some of the things that I see students doing here together that I believe ended up being really important. Some of the things that I saw students being able to do here was that they were able to choose examples from the text to illustrate ideas. The other thing that I saw them being able to do was trace character development. So you saw, for example, them being able to talk about the way a character was in the beginning of the story, use examples and evidence from the story around that, and also continue that throughout the story and talk about character change as well and the causes for that change. I believe that they were also able to develop and defend theories that they were developing from the text. They were able to use the patterns that they detected across the story to defend their own ideas about these characters and whether or not they were feeling alienated and marginalized. The other thing that I believe that they were able to do, again, a discussion allows for that, is that they were able to build on others' ideas. And all of these different skills or abilities allow students to really dig into interrogating texts. So remember earlier I was mentioning that some of the conditions of interrogating text is about the individual substantive text. Our teachers believe that the namesake would get them there. Issues of immigration, issues of assimilation as well, of marginalization, and one young person's experience with trying to grapple with all of those. A lot of our students face the same experiences. And our teachers wanted them to be able to think about that, not just again in the book, but also in their own lives as well. And while I believe that students could do that individually to some degree, a discussion allows them to be able to share those ideas and confirm on their own. So I'm going to continue and talk a little bit about, so I'm just going to continue and remind us about the conditions for interrogating texts. We talked about substantive text, talk, and writing, in addition to all of these other ones, modeling, time, choice, and feedback as well. If you're doing regularly all of those different features, right? All of the modeling and the choice and the feedback, including substantive text, allowing regular time for talk and writing, however informal or formal it is, the practice is going to get students to a deeper level of interrogation. And you'll know that students are doing some good work with interrogation if those conditions are met. So you can ask yourself, if the conditions are met, you can think about the students are the ones who are really doing the work. Like, who's really spending the time doing the work in your class? Is it you and your hustle around the room? Or is it the students doing the meaningful work of reading and talking and discussing and engaging with text regularly? Where is the ratio tipped toward in your classroom? The other thing that happens if the conditions are met is that teachers are really just kind of on the sidelines. They're the ones who are listening in on what students can do, on those discussions and individual ideas that they're sharing. And they're the ones who are guiding students through their models and their support and their feedback. They're not the ones who are always leading the class. It's really the student. Conditions are also met if the students are engaged in sophisticated work. Students could be engaged in really busy work and just be doing some recall and memorization. And I know that we're beyond that, but it's a good thing to remember that students are doing sophisticated work when they're synthesizing, when they're analyzing regularly, when they're able to critique not just the text, but also the author. And they're able to hypothesize, try out their theories about the stories that they're reading or the articles or the issues. Conditions are also met if students are growing as people, not just they're growing as readers and writers, which of course is important, but that they're also growing as people. They're understanding a little bit more about their own place in the world. They're understanding a little bit more about their own realities, about their own friendships, their families, why they're here, what they're doing. That feels like it ends up being so important. And I think there was a little bit of evidence of that in the discussion. So now I want us to talk a little bit about what interrogating texts across the day look like. So at our school, one initiative that we've been trying, we're a school of many initiatives, but one that we've been trying to work on a little bit more over the past couple of years is have a regular space for content area teachers to share their ideas and their practices and their problems related to practice around literacy, around the reading and writing that students are required to do in their classrooms. So what this looks like is, or what hopefully this will look like this year, we've tried different ways, different configurations of this over the past couple years, is that about once a month or at least twice a semester, the history, English, and science teachers come together during one of their prep periods. They come ready to do some work together as it relates to literacy. So some of the work our teachers have done is develop a common rubric for argumentative writing, for example. Other work that they've done is identify 1, 2, or 3 students, and each teacher brings some writing that that student has done in their class so that they can really understand more holistically who that student is as a reader or as a writer, what they see the student being able to do well, and how they see that student growing, and what implications does that have for next practice for that student. And also to be able to track individual progress. So how is so-and-so doing in your class? So-and-so did this amazing job with this literary essay. Have they been able to do that similar work with their science lab? Are they able to bring that kind of writing to their history research as well? So all of those possibilities can occur if teachers can come together and talk about what they're doing throughout the day. So this is now moving us from the individual work that teachers can do in their own classrooms to the shared work that might gain traction in the classroom. I'm going to show you a small example of this that the 10th grade teachers worked on a couple of years ago. They realized, or they were able to name for themselves, that, gee, in a lot of classrooms, we ask students to annotate. And what does that actually mean when we're asking our students to annotate? And so they distilled a few different practices that they believe they wanted every student to be able to own, to be held accountable to whenever they were annotating, whether it was science research, whether it was a primary or secondary source in history, or whether it was short text in English. So this is, it's called a 10th grade annotation poster. Each teacher made the same exact poster that they hung up in their rooms. So you can imagine from one class to another, a student would be able to travel and see the same information from one class to the next. And so the student ends up receiving a message by this shared expectation of annotation that A, annotation is important for interrogating texts. My teacher's expecting me to do this. And B, I can bring what I've learned about annotation from one class to the next and practice it over and over again. So interrogating text can lead to some kind of transfer as well. So I'll show you another example of now what that might look like across the grades. So you might have at your school, or you might be familiar in your districts, of departmental meetings as well, where teachers come together of the same department, the same content area, and study different topics. And so one of the things that we did as an English department, we call ourselves vertical teams because we work together from grade 6 to 12 vertically, is to think a little bit about coming together to share problems of practice, to develop mutual goals in a particular area of literacy or in English language arts, to take on different aspects of the work, and also to share practices. We often share our best practices as well. So I'll show you in April when we came together, I'll show you some examples of what we ended up talking about, which was literary analysis. And we believe that students at our school they were making some great strides in literary analysis, but still we saw some gaps that we wanted to address as a vertical team. And so here were some common problems that teachers were naming during that meeting. Students were writing the same sentence starters after analysis. If I read "this shows that" one more time, I'm gonna scream. Teachers also noticed they analyze well in discussion, but the writing is a show. They also said their analysis doesn't explain how the quote connects to the claim or the big idea or the thesis or the topic sentence. And teachers also noticed that we said, say what? They followed the structure of the essay or the paragraph, but the analysis is inaccurate or superficial. So we broke up into groups to try to address these problems. So 6th grade teachers were meeting with 10th grade teachers. What can we do? What have we done? How can we address these problems vertically as a group? What can we take on in the 7th grade to address these issues? What can we take on in the 9th grade? And so I want to show you a little bit about what we did. And here's just some examples of it. What we ended up doing was one of our teachers at one of our vertical teams, she said, you know, it would be a pretty amazing thing if we had a couple of students in each grade respond to the same exact story, so that we could get a sense of what does it look like and sound like at Eastside, at our school, for students to do literary analysis from 6th grade all the way to 12th grade. So I'm going to show you a little bit about what we ended up doing. We just followed a couple of steps. English teachers brainstormed the story that they believed that all students could read, but also, again, was substantive, that all students could do some meaningful work with. So that was All Summer in a Day by Ray Bradbury. We identified 2 students per grade who typically write analysis that meets or exceeds standards. Then we asked all of those students, those 2 students per grade, the same question, which was, what are your ideas about this text after reading it? Think about characters, setting, theme, and perspective. Use evidence from the text to support those ideas. And we also collected students' annotations as well, and along with their writing. So I actually pulled every single one of the students they just sat in my office to do this work. And so I'm just going to share with you really quickly a little bit of what some students, what some of the students wrote. These are just some examples. So here, for example, one student writes, after reading All Summer in a Day by Ray Bradbury, it seems as though the author's purpose was to show that you shouldn't live life in a monotone way, and that once you do something over and over again, it changes you. Then there's the student who was identified as a 10th medium. After a quote, they wrote, this quote shows how she was severely mistreated because of her differences and the jealousy from other children. Another student in the 10th grade, Ray Bradbury conveys the theme of joy or lack thereof in his short story through both characters and certain elements of setting. This was from an example that could be from the 12th grade. The context of Ray Bradbury's All Summer in a Day help enforce the author's message of how people shouldn't get discredited and not believed when it comes to serious things. So we've got, again, these are just some examples, but we've got examples from 6th grade all the way to 12th grade, 2 students per grade. We haven't had the chance to actually look at it yet as a staff or as an English department, but here are some possible next steps that I believe that we should do for this work. I want us to be able to look at this work together as a group and thinking about this idea of what students can do with analysis of texts. The next thing that I believe that we need to do is really ask this challenging question of, does it align with our expectations? Do students writing right now about text really reflect what we believe 7th grade meeting standard ought to look like? Or 11th grade high achieving or exceeding standard should really look like? And once we've done that work together, once we've named what we believe students can do and think about whether or not it meets our level, now we need to think about what are our implications for teaching collectively and individually. So we're pretty much at the end of the presentation, and I just want to highlight a couple of things before we end. This idea of substantive text ends up being so important for the work that we do to support students to interrogate our texts. As I mentioned before, I want to make sure that the texts that students are engaging with to interrogate are culturally relevant, reflect students' background and experiences, but also expose them to unfamiliar worlds. I believe that as students are doing both of those things, they understand more of their own realities and the reality of the world that's in them, that they are in. The more they get a chance to interrogate those texts, I believe they understand more about their own position in it. The other thing that we talked about that ended up being really important was the talk that students do pretty regularly. I showed you one example, which was the accountable talk of having a small group of students being able to come together to talk about the text. So that can happen at the end of a book, while students are reading, but any chance that students are talking, I believe they're actually internalizing all of the skills and abilities that we want them to be able to practice. The other thing that we talked about is students, our ability to support students to be able to write regularly in the way that they can interrogate texts. And the example of being able to connect what they're practicing, what they're thinking about, what they have already asserted about some of these issues, and how they're positioning their own ideas with what the author is trying to share with them ends up being really valuable work that students shouldn't be able to do just once in a unit, but pretty regularly throughout the unit too. And finally, I talked to you a little bit about the way that students can interrogate texts across the day in their content area classes as well, and also vertically as well across the grades. So some of this you can do on your own. And the thing that I feel like ends up being new to this work is how can you come together with even one colleague down the hall, or one colleague in a different grade, or two colleagues to come together to do some of this work to support transfer and gain traction of students' skills and abilities. So I really enjoyed myself today, and I hope that you did too. I really enjoyed the ability to be able to share some of these major ideas around interrogating texts across the day and across the grades. I'd love to see any comments or questions. You can feel free to tweet to me if you would like to, and I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chantal, for that amazing presentation. I think we all, as teachers and educators around the world, tend to work in isolation so often, and really lose that traction that we could have by pulling in texts from across the content areas and pulling in our colleagues from across the room to join us in pushing for our kids to be more skilled readers and writers. So thank you so much for those resources and your chat. For those of you who are still with us, do stay tuned for our closing session. It is it's quite special. We have for closing, we have with us Amber Mayaku and Lisa Almashi from the Teaching Tolerance, talking about their project in pushing for teaching tolerance in the classroom. So do stay with us for that. And thanks once again for joining us, and thanks to you again, Chantal.